York, and you are live in the CNN newsroom. So glad you're with us. First this hour, a major announcement from the White House. Tomorrow night at 9, President Trump will address the nation to reveal a new strategy in Afghanistan. This major address comes as brand new polling reveals the president is underwater in some key states that propelled him to the White House in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Take a look. His approval rating doesn't top 36%. This is according to a new survey taken after the Charlottesville violence. Hoping to boost support, the president is holding a campaign-style rally in Phoenix, Arizona this Tuesday. Even though local officials are warning against it, the city's mayor is asking the president to cancel this event out of fear it could lead to violence, and at least one lawmaker agrees. Congressman Ruben Gallego of Arizona tells the Washington Post, quote, "I absolutely think it's inappropriate to be holding a political rally a few days after an innocent woman was mowed down by a neo-Nazi. It's throwing tinder onto an ongoing fire." I'll talk to Congressman Gallego in just a moment, but first I want to go live to CNN's Boris Sanchez in Bridgewater, New Jersey, near the Trump Golf Resort, where the president is spending the weekend. Boris, let's start with the presidential address tomorrow night. What are you learning about this decision on Afghanistan?
Hey there, Anna. Yeah, the president is set to speak to the nation at 9 p.m. tomorrow night. We don't know exactly what this decision will be, but we know that the White House has been working on this Afghanistan strategy for several months. The president has been presented with several different options. He actually tweeted about coming to a final decision yesterday, saying that he had met with top military brass at Camp David and that he had come to an important decision, not just on Afghanistan, but also across the region. We've heard from the White House that this is not only going to be an Afghanistan strategy, but one for the entire south of Asia. There are several different options on the table here, some of them including a troop surge. That's been supported by several Republican congressmen, including John McCain. The other avenue here is a withdrawal or a transfer of responsibility from the U.S. military to several private contractors. We got a chance to hear from the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, earlier today. He was asked about this. He wouldn't reveal details of this new plan, except to say that he was going to leave it to the president to explain his decision to the American people. Here's more of what Secretary Mattis had to say.
I was not willing to make significant troop lifts until we made certain we knew what was the strategy, what was the commitment going in. In that regard, the president has made a decision, as he said. He wants to be the one to announce it to the American people, so I'll stand silent until then, until that point.
Anna, and we've just learned that the president is wheels up here in Bedminster, leaving on Marine One, heading to the airport to then head back to Washington, D.C. This wraps up that 17-day working vacation for the president, and this really is a very important decision for not only the president, but for the country. This has been the longest war in American history, dating back to the fall of 2001. You remember that back in 2014, then President Obama declared an end of combat operations in Afghanistan. It was just earlier this year in February when the commander of troops in Afghanistan, General John Nicholson, said that U.S. and Afghan troops had essentially reached a stalemate with the Taliban. So it'll be interesting to see how the president approaches this moving forward, not just again in Afghanistan, but that whole region in the south of Asia, Anna.
Right, a conflict that continues to claim American lives. Boris Sanchez, thank you. I'm now joined by Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego of Arizona. Congressman, thank you for spending time with me. I know you have strong feelings about this rally President Trump is holding in your state on Tuesday, but first I want to start with this big announcement set to make tomorrow on Afghanistan. You are a Marine Corps veteran who has been on the front lines of the war against terrorism. You also serve on the House Armed Services Committee. So I'm curious, has your committee been notified of the president's decision on this new strategy?
No, we certainly haven't. As a matter of fact, we've had very little input from the Secretary of Defense or any other apparatus of the White House, considering that this is a huge policy change potentially. And the fact that they're doing it in this manner, I think, kind of makes me question the efficacy of what he's going to be announcing.
So as a veteran who has served in the Middle East, you have a unique perspective. What do you hope the president announces tomorrow?
Well, the one thing we know about fighting in the Middle East and fighting terrorists is you never win this alone. The only way you win these types of war, if there is such thing as winning when you're fighting terrorism at all, is to make sure you're working in a multilateral manner with different countries, and you're basically trying to attack the root of the problem. The root here is Taliban, but it's also, on the other hand, the fact that Afghanistan itself is a corrupt nation. Its infrastructure is below grade. There's no jobs for young men to actually work to, and with that type of environment, it's pretty much a good breeding ground for terrorism, and/or basically people being bought off by the Taliban. Any suggestion that somehow just a troop surge will solve this problem is just a playbook that doesn't work, hasn't worked in the past, and will only put more targets on the back of U.S. members of the military out there. And secondary, if he believes that somehow contracting out the war is going to bring us any more peace, that's just a ridiculous thought, and it would never happen.
So what would you do? If not sending more Americans, would you withdraw everybody?
You'd have to work actually in a stronger manner. First of all, you'd actually have to demand more reforms from the Afghan government to basically try to wipe out the corruption that's eating away at the country. Half of the military is somehow or another involved in protecting the heroin trade, which is also eating away and the Afghan military, which is also eating away at the morale of the country. There is so much graft there that it's difficult to do business. So many men will end up doing terrorist acts for pay, especially whenever the farming season is not taking place. A lot of these things, and part of the problem is to continue the slow but necessary training of the Afghan military to help them be better soldiers. And it's not just them being able to shoot, but what we need to do is teach them how to do the logistics of collecting information, finding out where the targets are, collecting intelligence, even basics as paying the soldiers the amount of money they're due, making sure they have the type of bullets and the type of boots that they're supposed to. The Afghan military supply and contract process is riddled with corruption, and it also creates a widespread discontent among the Afghan soldiers, which also creates a lot of desertion, which makes it very difficult for you to have a very veteran-led as well as experience-led military. All these things need to happen before we somehow think that miraculously putting more men, American men and women on the ground is somehow going to create a solution.
Gotcha.
The solution for Afghanistan could only be found in Afghanistan.
I can tell you've thought a lot about this. I just want to be clear then where you stand. Would you support any solution that means sending more Americans to Afghanistan?
No, absolutely not, because that's not a solution.
I want to ask you now about the rally the president is holding in Phoenix on Tuesday. You have called it inappropriate. You say it will be like, quote, throwing tinder onto an ongoing fire. Couldn't this be an opportunity, however, for the president to deliver a much-needed message of unity to this divided nation?
Oh, absolutely. If he was a normal president, that would actually be a great time to do that. But let's just look at the facts. Every time he's had an opportunity, he basically has fumbled the ball. The first time he had an opportunity, he basically equated neo-Nazis with protesters, peaceful protesters that were protesting against neo-Nazis. And then his basically recalibration the third time around was even more horrendous than not. And at the same time, he's inviting Sheriff Joe Arpaio to join him on stage, which kind of gives us an indication of where he's going with this. It would be a great time for him to heal the country's wounds. He doesn't know how to do that. He's not about the country. He's about himself first. Hence why he's going to Phoenix so soon after such a tragic event that happened in Charlottesville. Instead of laying back and letting the country heal, he's going to put together a campaign event.
Congressman, and yet the president tweeted about the protests in Boston yesterday, and he applauded the protesters. He said sometimes protests were needed in order for a nation to heal. He also congratulated the Democratic mayor of Boston for how he and the local officials on the ground handled this event. Does that in any way make you hopeful that this president is holding this rally in Arizona for the right reason?
That'd be great, except you also forgot the other tweet where he tweeted out that protesters were throwing urine at the police officers, essentially trying to set up this argument that protesters are anti-police.
He called them anti-police agitators first. Yes, that's true.
Absolutely, yeah. So it kind of tells you where his mentality is. Look, the president wants a culture war. He understands that he's not going to be delivered on any of the promises that he promised most of his voters. So instead, he will, try to play all sides, which is what we saw with those two tweets, and then at the same time calling these peaceful protesters that he congratulated also anti-police at the same time. The president,
he did
is not
end
about
on a
anybody
high
else but
note.
it's.
You got to admit, he ended on a high note with that last tweet of unity, talking about I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one. Can you give him some credit for moving the right direction?
If we're using Trump metrics, sure, but we would never allow any other president in the country to act and behave the way that this president has. Somehow we've all changed the rules, including the media, that we're going to start giving credit for things that he should do naturally as a leader of this country. I'm glad he's at least tweeting out one or two things that are nice once in a while, but let's be honest, any other president, whether it was a Democrat or Republican, we would say he has been acting irresponsible, and by the way, that this rally would be considered irresponsible and unpresidential-like.
Congressman Ruben Gallego, we appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for your service to this country. After being ousted from the White House, Steve Bannon is doing anything but staying quiet. Up next, what he is now revealing about the Trump administration and his gloomy prediction for the Republican Party. You're live in the CNN Newsroom. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says he is sticking with President Trump despite nearly 300 of his former classmates at Yale co-signing a letter calling for him to resign over President Trump's response to Charlottesville. Now, the letter in part reads, President Trump has declared himself a sympathizer with groups whose values are antithetical to those values we consider fundamental to our sacred honor as Americans, as men and women of Yale, and as decent human beings. President Trump made those declarations loudly, clearly, and unequivocally, and he said them as you stood next to him. We call upon you as our friend, our classmate, and as a fellow American to resign in protest of President Trump's support of Nazism and white supremacy. We know you are better than this. We are counting on you to do the right thing. Now, Mnuchin responded yesterday, in part, writing, I don't believe the allegations against the president are accurate. And I believe that having highly talented men and women in our country surrounding the president and his administration should be reassuring to you and all the American people. Let me bring in the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. Jonathan, thanks for being with us. Would you like to see people like Steve Mnuchin resign?
Look, it is really quite a sad day when our Treasury Secretary, instead of talking about macroeconomic issues or exchange rates, has to talk about Nazis marching through a major American city. I mean, what's really a problem is that our president has shown such a lack of moral leadership that his Secretary of the Treasury and other aides, Jewish or not, are being forced to ask themselves, do I belong here? Can I serve? Where is my moral compass? Look, at the ADL, we've been tracking hate for over 100 years. We knew that march in Charlottesville, all the experts did, was going to be the largest gathering of white supremacists in more than a decade. We knew it was going to be violent. Our hearts break for Heather Heyer and her family. What we didn't know was that the president would fail again and again and again to clearly stand with the rest of America and instead try to equivocate between white supremacists and neo-Nazis, the rest of us. That's really the issue.
So if you feel that strongly, what do you think is the solution to maybe, one, holding the president accountable for his words, and two, making some kind of progress?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, we've got to keep the pressure on. I think it's really important to push the president not only to call this out, but to take action. It's stunning to me that even in his comments on Monday, before he went off the rails on Tuesday, we didn't even have a plan of action about how do we deal with hate. Now, here's the good news, I would say. We can't wait. And so at the ADL, we can't wait. So we literally announced on Friday a partnership with over 250 mayors, Republicans and Democrats, big cities and little cities, who've signed the Mayor's Compact, a new initiative between the ADL and the U.S. Conference of Mayors.
To do what?
To help cities respond, prepare proactively to white supremacist marches. In fact, Mayor Walsh in Boston is one of our signatories, and that helped in part him prepare and be ready for the march that happened yesterday in Boston.
Do you agree with some of the people who argue if you are part of this administration, the right move would not be to resign if you are upset with the president's comments, if you reject what he said? Instead, being part of his team can help to influence his actions moving forward, influence policy, and so forth?
Look, I think it's hard for me to judge Jewish staffers or non-Jewish staffers and how they make their decisions. I think they've got to wake up in the morning and say, does this map to my moral compass? Can I feel comfortable with these values? And I would say, from the ADL's point of view, that the values the president espoused on Tuesday are not American values. We believe in pluralism. We believe in tolerance. We believe in respect. And to suggest that there were fine people among the neo-Nazis who marched in those streets saying blood and soil, saying Jews will not replace us. I'll tell you what, Jews and other people, we will replace them. We will replace their indecency with decency. We'll replace their inhumanity with humanity.
That video was a punch in the gut for anybody who watched that. I could not believe my eyes. I want to ask you about Boston, because you brought that up.
Yeah.
Yesterday we witnessed 40,000 people taking to the streets, and 99.9% of them, according to the police commissioner, were there for the right reasons, fighting hatred and bigotry. The president was tweeting during this protest, and here's what he first tweeted out. This was his first tweet. "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." And then a little bit later, I believe it was actually during the press conference or just after the press conference, he writes, "I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one." That last tweet, do you see him turning the conversation? Are we making progress?
Well, I'm glad he's catching on, because guess what? The country is coming together. You've had former presidents, Republicans and Democrat. You have members of Congress, Republican and Democrat, members of the clergy, members of the business community, even members of the armed forces. Everyone has stood together in unanimity against the values of white supremacy and for the values of pluralism and justice. That's the real face of America. So I think it's a good thing if the president comes around to it. We at the ADL and other groups, we will keep pushing and fighting on the front lines against hate and extremism.
All right, Jonathan Greenblatt, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
sharing with us tonight. Coming up, new details on that bizarre sonic weapon attack in Cuba that hurt a number of U.S. and Canadian diplomats. We'll tell you what CNN is just learning about who else could be affected. You're live in the CNN newsroom. Some former students of Liberty University are sending their diplomas back as part of a group protest of University President Jerry Falwell Jr. and his continued support of President Trump. In a letter, the graduates slammed Falwell for backing the president even after he blamed many sides for the violence at that white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia last week. Falwell tweeted this: "Finally a leader in White House. Jobs returning. North Korea backing down. Bold, truthful statement about Charlottesville tragedy. So proud of Donald Trump." Now, a day later, he attempted to clarify by tweeting, "The truth as stated by Donald Trump is that violent white supremacists, Nazi, KKK, and similar hate groups are pure evil and un-American." And then today, a third clarification.
The bold and truthful statements I was referring to were his willingness to call evil and terrorism by its name, to identify the groups, the Nazis, the KKK, the white supremacists. That's something a leader should do, and I admire him for that. You know, President Trump is something that we haven't had in national leadership in a long time. He's substance over form. So many of our politicians, recent leaders, national leaders, have been form over substance. They tell people what they want to hear. They sugarcoat everything, or they have sugarcoated everything. And I think the American people have gotten sort of thin-skinned, and I think they need to listen to the substance of what he said.
So back in January of 2016, Falwell became one of the earliest evangelical leaders to endorse Trump at a time when many conservative Christian leaders were expressing concern about the president's, then candidate Trump's, multiple marriages and past support for abortion rights. In the meantime, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is standing by the president, even as hundreds of his former Yale classmates urge him to resign in protest over his Charlottesville remarks. Mnuchin, who is a Jewish member of the cabinet and was at that press conference when Trump shifted some of the blame away from neo-Nazis, he issued a full-throated defense of the president. This weekend, he said, quote, "While I find it hard to believe I should have to defend myself on this or the president, I feel compelled to let you know that the president in no way, shape, or form believes that neo-Nazi and other hate groups who endorse violence are equivalent to groups that demonstrate in peaceful and lawful ways." Joining me now is Rabbi Marvin Heyer, founder of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, an institution that fights anti-Semitism and other prejudice. He also performed a prayer at President Trump's inauguration. Rabbi, thanks for spending time with us. Do you think the pressure being put on Mnuchin and other Jewish members of Trump's staff is fair?
Well, I don't know about that, but I know what my opinion is very, very clearly. I do not think the president did the right thing. The president, first of all, in his first statement, should not have mentioned the stock market and jobs when you're facing the greatest tragedy that we have, Nazi and the Klan marching in the heartland of America 75 years after the Holocaust. And so I think he should never have equated that with other demonstrators. That was a very big mistake, and I think he knows it.
What would you do if you were a member of his staff right now, if you were Steve Mnuchin or Gary Cohn or somebody else?
Well, I don't know the circumstance. I would criticize. I think that if they should speak their conscience. In other words, it wasn't handled right. I don't think anybody will argue that when the President of the United States comes out, and this is the first time that he's speaking about it, and he begins his conversation by telling us about jobs, and then addresses this, and then makes the comparison that the demonstrators on the other side, they were both wrong. That is quite preposterous.
I want to get your reaction to this exchange the president had with CNN's Jim Acosta. Let's watch.
You don't have any doubt about it.
But, Mr. President,
and if you reported it accurately,
but the neo-Nazis started it, sir. The neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest the removal of that statue.
And you had some very bad people in that group. You also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people.
No, sir. The Nazis. There are no fine people in the Nazis. There are no fine people in the Nazis.
So, Rabbi, as you watch or hear those comments, what's going through your mind?
Well, what's going through my mind is that human beings, all human beings, are fallible. You know, Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg. We criticized him for that. Bitburg was a cemetery where the SS are buried. President Trump should not have handled this the way he did. He should have been unequivocal. He made a mistake, and let's hope he learned from it.
What would learning from it look like?
Never repeating that again. If I were giving him advice, I would apologize for that and go forward. Look, we have a lot of issues in the world, and we don't want America, 75 years after 400,000 GIs gave their lives to liberate Europe from Nazism, to have to replay the Klan and Nazism in the heartland of America.
Well, I know what he's planning to do going forward at this point. He's planning to have a campaign-style rally in Arizona this week. And again, here was the scene last summer when then candidate Trump was greeted by protesters and his giant inflatable mock-up of him wearing a KKK robe. I was on the ground reporting during this time, and I was talking with some of those protesters who represent immigrants' rights groups. Obviously, immigration and race issues are hot issues in this part of our country as well. This time around, the Phoenix mayor is now expressing concern that if the president comes there after Charlottesville, it could spark something that could become violent. If the president goes forward with this, what message does that send?
Well, let me say this. If the president would ask me what should he do in Phoenix, I would tell him, condemn the Nazis and the Klan and never mention the other demonstrators. Make it unequivocal while the whole country is watching. They are not the same.
Rabbi Marvin Heyer, thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Coming up tomorrow, millions of Americans will be able to see the first total solar. Hello, you are in the CNN Newsroom. Thank you for joining me. I'm Ana Cabrera in New York, and we begin with a major announcement from the White House. Tomorrow night at 9, President Trump will address the nation and the troops to reveal a new strategy in Afghanistan. Now, this major address comes as brand new polling reveals the president is underwater in some key states that propelled him to the White House. In Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, take a look. His approval rating doesn't even top 36%. This is according to a new survey taken after Charlottesville and the violence there. Hoping to boost support, the president is holding a campaign-style rally in Phoenix, Arizona this Tuesday, even though local officials are warning against it. The city's mayor has asked the president to cancel this event out of fear it could lead to violence. And at least one lawmaker agrees. Congressman Ruben Gallego of Arizona tells the Washington Post, quote, I absolutely think it's inappropriate to be holding a political rally a few days after an innocent woman was mowed down by a neo-Nazi, throwing tinder onto an ongoing fire. CNN's Boris Sanchez is in Bridgewater, New Jersey, near the Trump Golf Resort, where the president is spending the weekend. And Boris, let's start with this big address tomorrow night. What can you tell us about the deliberations leading up to this big decision on Afghanistan?
Yeah, Anna, this is actually something that the president tweeted about yesterday. He was alluding to some important decisions that were made in a meeting with top military brass at Camp David on Friday, and he included in that tweet that a decision had been made on Afghanistan. This is something that the White House had been working on for several months. Very different options on the table here. Everything from a surge in troops, something that Senator John McCain of Arizona supported, to a complete withdrawal, or even potentially, as former White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon argued for, a shifting of responsibilities to private companies, mercenaries, so to speak. Beyond all of that, Secretary of Defense James Mattis was asked earlier today what the decision ultimately was on Afghanistan. He decided not to step on the president's toes and let him explain the decision for himself. Here's more from Secretary Mattis. It looks like we don't have that sound, Anna, but he essentially said that he wanted the president to explain the decision himself. Interestingly, he also noted that this wasn't just a strategy on Afghanistan, but this was a full South Asia strategy. To put this decision into context, Anna, this is the longest war in American history, dating back to fall of 2001. You'll recall that in 2014, President Obama declared an end to all combat operations there. Fast forward to February of this year, when the commander of troops in Afghanistan, General James Nicholson, said that the United States and Afghan troops had essentially reached a stalemate with the Taliban. So it'll be interesting to see how President Trump now moves forward from this, again, the longest war in American history.
Sadly, we continue to lose American lives there just this week, in fact. Boris, I want to turn and ask you about Phoenix and this upcoming rally. Is there any sign the White House may be heeding some of these warnings from the officials there?
No sign yet on a lot of this criticism against the president follows last Tuesday's off-the-rails press conference. The president received a lot of harsh criticism for, you mentioned the mayor of Phoenix asking the president to delay this event, others not going quite as far, but asking the president to have a more inclusive tone in his message, including Ohio governor and former presidential candidate John Kasich. He was on State of the Union with Jake Tapper earlier today. Here's what he said.
You're going to go to Phoenix and make a speech? Fine. That's your right. You can go there. He's got free speech just like the rest of us have it. But when you go, try to use that as an opportunity to say something to bring people together. You might recall when he delivered that speech to the Congress, the day after, the people on CNN said, well, tonight Donald Trump became president. He has it within him. If he can maintain discipline, he has it within him, I think, to overcome this and move forward.
So all eyes will be on the president, not only tomorrow night at 9 when he delivers that address detailing the plan forward for Afghanistan, but also on Tuesday night when he holds a rally in Phoenix. Anna.
Right, Boris Sanchez in Bridgewater, New Jersey for us. Thank you. Now, I was actually in Phoenix a little over a year ago, last June, here reporting for CNN, when then candidate Trump held a rally there. And I want to show you one of the reasons officials might be concerned about emotions boiling over. This was what Trump, the candidate, arrived to last year. A giant inflatable likeness of him wearing a KKK robe. Again, this was last year. His visit Tuesday comes exactly 1 week after he doubled down on that initial Charlottesville comment, drawing a moral equivalency between white supremacists and counter-protesters. With us to discuss, White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner, Sarah Westwood, CNN political commentator and Democratic strategist Maria Cardona, and CNN political commentator and KABC talk radio host John Phillips. Sarah, what is the political calculation to go forward with this rally despite the safety concerns?
Well, for President Trump, rallies have typically been a way for him to gain control of his message at times when it feels like it's starting to spin out of control. Now is certainly one of those times. President Trump has the opportunity to trumpet his accomplishments. He often feels like the media unfairly doesn't cover what his administration has been able to achieve. And in the case of this potential Sheriff Joe Arpaio pardon, the White House may be taking a calculated risk that whatever blowback it gets from pardoning Sheriff Joe Arpaio, that can't possibly be as bad as the backlash over Charlottesville. So that might explain at least the timing of the Arpaio pardon. It doesn't necessarily have to be now. The sheriff hasn't even been sentenced yet. So all of this may be a calculated risk from the White House to get out of the hole that they dug with Charlottesville and try to move on to something else.
Of course, that pardoning has been thrown out there. That's not confirmed at this point. The White House hasn't said that's going to happen for sure, although there is some indication that may be part of this rally. John, take a look at the new NBC Mars poll. This was taken after Charlottesville, and it finds that the majority of voters in 3 key states the president won simply don't approve of the job he's doing. I want to play for you what Republican Senator Tim Scott said President Trump needs to do next.
We need our president to sit down with folks who have a personal experience, a deep connection to the horror and the pain of this country's provocative racial history. If the president wants to have a better understanding and appreciation for what he should do next, he needs to hear something from folks who have gone through this painful history. Without that personal connection to the painful past, it will be hard for him to regain that moral authority from my perspective.
So, John, is a large impersonal campaign-style rally with his base really what the president needs to do next? Why not go visit one-on-one with the Americans who aren't his base but are still part of the fabric of this country that he now represents?
I think going to Arizona is a great idea for the president. As those polls indicate that you just referenced, he's had a rough week, and he goes into these campaign rallies and just lights up the room like a Christmas tree. And there's one thing that we learned from the President Obama administration, and particularly with the battle over health care, where he passed health care with nothing but Democratic votes, 0 Republican votes. And that is this: the political calculation of success in a deeply divided America is to make sure that your team sticks with you. And the fact that he's underwater now in states that he won in the November election means he needs to pull the base back together. And the Trump base loves Sheriff Joe Arpaio. So to go to Arizona and to give him a pardon and to have a fantastic rally that's carried on television, I think would be a great shot in the arm for President Trump.
And yet, John, is that going to unite the people in this country who are hurting?
Well, it's going to unite his base. And if those poll numbers are accurate, that means that he's losing some people who voted for him in the November election. He needs to pull those people back in, and this rally will help him do that.
Maria, do you agree?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I do agree that it will ignite his base, and that is certainly what he desperately needs. But I think that it is it's a calculated risk to go there, but I think it's stupidity on his part right now. But here's the problem, Anna. He doesn't care. I agree with Governor Kasich, and I agree with Senator Scott that it would be smart for this president to try to seek beyond his base and unite Americans, unite all of those communities who have been fearful from the day that he stepped into the Oval Office, and with good reason. African Americans, Muslims, Latinos, the LGBT community. But guess what? This president doesn't care about them. He has been very clear, even from the campaign, that he does not care about communities of color. He does not care about the people who do not go to his rally. That is why he is going to Phoenix, because it is like a security blanket for him. He is underwater right now, not just nationally, but in the 3 Midwestern states that actually gave him the presidency. He is at record low approval ratings. The generic congressional ballot, Democrats are leading by 10 points nationally and more in these 3 Midwestern states. He knows that. He is in trouble. This is a president in crisis. He lacks moral leadership. He has demonstrated moral decay. He's doing nothing to convince that the majority of Americans who did not want him to be in the White House, that he still wants to be their president, as well as those who come to his rallies.
Sarah, why do you think he is losing support among those states and the voters in the states that voted for him in the Rust Belt?
I think when you look into the frustrations that members of his base who have spoken to the media have expressed, It usually does not have to do with his inflammatory tweets. It doesn't have to do with whatever controversy is preoccupying Washington. But people are frustrated that Trump's agenda is not getting done. He's not making any progress on the border wall. Obviously, the attempt to repeal Obamacare failed spectacularly. They're not making progress on the travel ban, which got tied up in the courts. Everything that President Trump promised has been stopped by his own party, by Democrats, by his own inability to focus on his message. And because of that, he has slowly, steadily lost support among his base. You haven't seen as many sharp drops when these controversies pop up, but you have seen it decline gradually as voters, his own voters, become convinced that maybe the Republican agenda is not going to get done as quickly as he promised them.
Sarah Westwood, Maria Cardona, and John Phillips, our thanks to all of you. We appreciate it this weekend. Coming up, more fiery rhetoric from North Korea aimed directly at the U.S. We'll tell you what the regime is.
Last weekend caused racial, religious, and cultural tensions to flare, creating really an explosive climate throughout the country, one that still lingers. President Trump received a wave of backlash after delivering mixed messages on who was to blame for the violence.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides. I watched those very closely, much more closely than you people watched it. And you had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent. And nobody wants to say that, but I'll say it right now. I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, would say.
Kill the person. Heather hired
They showed up in Charlottesville
Excuse me.
to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as you, and you had some very bad people in that group. You also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
With me now are three religious leaders, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, Imam Dai Abdullah, and Reverend Suzanne Johnson Cook. I want to thank all of you for coming. I feel like we need voices from across the spectrum. There's a big appetite for voices from across the spectrum, just looking for a positive message here, a way forward. I'm just curious, after these events of the past week, which frankly still linger, I'm curious, what are the messages each of you is delivering to your congregations in terms of finding a way forward? Rabbi, if we could begin with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just returned yesterday from Charlottesville, where I had the opportunity to be with our congregation in Charlottesville over the Sabbath. And to tell you that they're traumatized is to say the obvious. But they're very clear that what happened last weekend was, in a sense, a moral eclipse. When the President of the United States was unable to distinguish between right and wrong, between love and hate, between racism and unity. And what is distressing is that if you can't have that moral clarity, you can't actually discern the very complicated issues. So the message that I was able to share this Friday night to this community, one of the oldest synagogues in Virginia, was that actually people of faith know what it means to have a view, a moral view of the universe. And we're not confused between racism and love. And the religious leadership of that community stood together with love and clarity and light in the midst of that moral eclipse, and was able to convey what actually is the way forward. We have to be clear that demonic hate expressed by KKK and neo-Nazis, they marched right around the synagogue during their Sabbath prayers last week. They were chanting anti-Semitic slogans. Those are sounds and sights that will not fade quickly from their sights, but also from all of ours. So we are called for moral discernment, and we must discern, and then we must stand together and understand that white supremacy isn't just a horrific rally in Charlottesville. It's embedded in the very policies of much of our government. You think about voter suppression, it is a form of white supremacy. So we've got real work to do, and people of faith don't need to only pray, not to only study biblical texts, but we need to actually raise our voices with love and clarity. And we hope the President of the United States will be able to be the moral leader. Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, called upon America to be in touch with the better angels of their nature. That's what a president is supposed to say. That's what he's supposed to call out in all of us, to bring those better angels so that we could be the country that we are meant to be.
Reverend Cook, if I could ask you, it was striking to many today that Senator Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican senator today, questioned the president's moral authority in his words. And I wonder if you share that concern.
I share very much. He's not alone in those thoughts whatsoever. You know, when you look at the civil rights movement, it was born in the black church. And so as an African American, we've been insulted. He says there were bad people on both sides. We say there's bad leadership at this time. But you asked us what we're preaching. I'm in Chautauqua Institute, upstate New York, an ecumenical gathering of people from every denomination, Jewish, Christians, across the board. And I talked today as a Black Baptist woman about Jewish women who took a stand for what was rightfully theirs. And, you know, they were peacefully protesting. And we have that right as Americans to do that. As a faith leader, what we try to do is bring conciliation, that people across the aisles from every perspective of life have the right to speak, and they also have the right to be heard. We need leadership that's not going to be insightful in terms of inciting riots, but insightful in terms of going deeper and understanding the meaning of leadership for a nation that's indivisible, one nation under God with liberty and justice for all.
Imam Abdullah, if I could ask you, because of course Muslims have been sadly an early target of the president's during the campaign, discussions of keeping Muslims out of the country, ending Muslim immigration, the attacks on the father of a Gold Star father as well. And some of that animus has continued in the president's public comments since he entered the White House. How do you speak to your congregations in a way that, listen, I imagine it's easy to find anger and resentment and disappointment. How do you speak to them about a way forward?
I've been looking at this and explaining that because Muslims come both from those who are domestic, or mean they're raised here, natives, Black Americans more particularly, but then also those who have been immigrants, that the real issue here is that we have to accept the framework that this is terrorism, that this event that happened last week was that it was a form of terrorism, and that terrorism takes place all over the world. So we're having our American form of terrorism, but Muslims, no matter where they are, they're attacked by other forms of terrorism in their own places, their countries of origins, as well as here. And so it's important for them to understand that, but that's not the only thing is to show anger, as you said a moment ago, but that they have to understand that it's building coalitions with other religious groups and with other types of movements as the way that we move forward, so that we are in unity together to make certain that all of our human rights are being taken care of, and that the authorities themselves understand that to try to separate us is the wrong way to do things, and to make certain that we can work together so that we can all prosper here. So,
let me ask you this question.
I think part of the process.
Sorry, complete your thought. I don't want to interrupt you.
Okay. I just basically saying that the way. I'm sorry, the way that he was, the president was saying the things, that there were good people on both sides. Yes, that may be true to a certain extent, but the vast majority of the people, there were people who were opposing those who wanted to have a particular point of view. And so I think that he was misguided in making that statement.
Well, let me ask you this before, we don't have a lot of time, before we go, because when I talk to friends and family, there's a lot of curiosity out there about what can I do? What can an individual do to improve the discourse, just the state of emotion in this country? And I wonder if before I go, and I'll start with you, Rabbi, Reverend, Imam, one thing that you say to your congregations that they could do to improve the atmosphere, to make a difference, a small difference, but to make a difference. Rabbi, I'll begin with you.
Sure. I think the key is not to return hate for hate. Actually return love and strength and justice. The opposite of hate is love.
And rightly being hailed as such for pushing his fiancée out of